Chapter 1. A Divided City. It was 1945. The Second World War had just ended. Berlin was in ruins. Buildings were destroyed. Streets were filled with rubble. People walked silently, looking for food, water, and hope. The city had been the heart of Nazi Germany, and now it was broken. After the war, the world's strongest countries made a plan. They decided what would happen to Germany. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France would each control part of the country. Berlin, even though it was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, would also be divided. The four powers split the city into zones: East Berlin for the Soviets and West Berlin shared by the Americans, British, and French. At first, people hoped this arrangement would work. They wanted peace after years of war. But things didn't stay peaceful for long. The Soviet Union had a different idea of how life should be. In the East, the government took control of everything: jobs, land, even what people could say. It promised equality, but in reality, people lived under strict rules. In the West, the United States and its allies wanted freedom and democracy. They helped rebuild, giving people jobs and hope. East and West had two very different futures. Tensions grew quickly. In 1948, the Soviets blocked all roads and trains into West Berlin. Their plan was to starve the Western powers out of the city. For almost a year, planes from the United States and Britain flew supplies into West Berlin. They brought food, medicine, and even candy for children. These flights were called the Berlin Airlift. Every day the planes came. Every day the people of West Berlin survived. The blockade failed, but the divide deepened. East Berlin and West Berlin were no longer just zones. They became two different worlds. Life in East Berlin was hard. The government controlled almost everything. People couldn't speak freely. If they complained, they could be arrested, or worse. The streets were gray and quiet. Shops were often empty. People waited in long lines for bread and milk. Many felt trapped, with no way to improve their lives. In West Berlin, life was brighter. There were cinemas, cafes, and busy streets. Children played in the parks. New buildings replaced the old, bombed ones. People could travel, share ideas, and build businesses. West Berliners were surrounded by East Germany, but they felt free. This difference was hard to ignore. Many East Berliners looked to the West with longing. They wanted freedom. They wanted the chance to live without fear. Some began to leave. At first, it was easy. People could cross the city freely. They took a train or walked across the border. Families reunited for dinners. Friends visited each other. But more and more East Berliners decided not to come back. By 1961, over 2.5 million people had fled to the West. Most were young, skilled workers, doctors, teachers, engineers. East Germany was losing its future. The government in the East grew desperate. They couldn't afford to let so many people leave. It wasn't just about numbers. Each person who left was proof that life in East Germany was failing. The leaders decided they had to act. They would stop people from leaving, at any cost. The city became a place of whispers and secrets. Families argued. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Some people believed in the East German government. They thought the Soviet way was the right way. Others dreamed of escape. They made plans in the dark, speaking softly, afraid someone might hear. Fear was everywhere. The Western powers watched with concern. They didn't want to lose West Berlin. It was a symbol of democracy and freedom in the middle of communist East Germany. But no one knew what the Soviets would do next. The air in Berlin felt heavy, like a storm was coming. And then it happened. On the night of August 13th, 1961, the East German government made its move. Soldiers and workers began to build. Barbed wire was stretched across the city. Streets were blocked. Train stations were closed. Families who had dinner together the night before were now separated. No one knew if they would ever see each other again. People woke up to a new reality. East Berliners stared at the wire, shocked. West Berliners stood on the other side, calling out to their friends and family. The border was sealed. The city, already divided in spirit, was now divided by force. At first, the barrier was just wire, but soon it became a wall. A real wall. Concrete slabs were put in place. Guard towers rose. Soldiers with guns patrolled day and night. No one could cross. No one could escape. For the people of Berlin, the wall was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong. It was the Cold War made real. On one side, people were free. On the other, they were prisoners. The wall cut through streets, parks, and even cemeteries. Families were torn apart. Friends became strangers. Some people tried to fight back. They wrote graffiti on the wall, messages of hope, anger, and defiance. But the wall stood tall, cold, and silent. It was a reminder to everyone. There was no way out. Life continued, but it wasn't the same. East Berliners tried to find happiness in small things. A good book, a secret smile, a quiet walk. West Berliners looked at the wall every day, wondering how long it would last. Many felt guilty for their freedom, knowing others weren't so lucky. Years passed, but the pain of the divide never went away. The Berlin Wall became a global symbol. Leaders from around the world came to West Berlin. They gave speeches, promising hope. But for the people who lived there, hope was hard to find. The wall was strong. It felt permanent. It felt like it would never come down. Still, deep inside, people didn't stop dreaming. East and West Berliners both longed for a day when the city would be whole again. When they could walk through the streets freely. When families could hug without borders. When Berlin could be one. That dream was just beginning. Chapter 2. The Curtain Falls. It was a warm summer evening in Berlin, August 12th, 1961. People walked through the streets, laughing and talking. Some visited friends in the West. Others spent time with family in the East. No one knew it would be their last chance to cross the city freely. In the east, whispers had begun. Soldiers were moving. Trucks carried supplies. Something was happening, but no one knew exactly what. The government kept it secret. People went to bed that night, unaware of how their world was about to change. And then it began. At midnight, thousands of East German soldiers spread across the city. Trucks stopped at key streets and corners. Workers jumped out, pulling rolls of barbed wire. The soldiers had orders to divide Berlin, block every road, close every path to the west. People who worked through the night, taxi drivers, bakers, and nurses, were the first to notice. One baker, still kneading his dough, looked outside and saw soldiers stretching barbed wire across the street. "What are they doing?" he asked. The soldiers didn't answer. They just worked quickly, blocking road after road. By dawn, the entire city was cut in two. In the early morning, Berliners woke up to an unfamiliar sound. Silence. The streets, normally buzzing with life, were still. Then came the shouts, "Look outside!" "What's happening?" "They're blocking the streets!" People ran to their windows. They saw barbed wire running through their neighborhoods. Guards with guns stood at every corner. East Berliners tried to cross, but the soldiers stopped them. "Turn back!" they shouted. In West Berlin, families stared across the wire in shock. They waved and called out to their loved ones. Some threw notes over the barrier. A father yelled to his son, "Stay there! Don't come back to the east!" But the son couldn't hear him clearly. The soldiers didn't care. The border was closed. By midday, panic spread. Families who had planned to meet that morning were separated. A woman, holding her baby, stood crying near a blocked road. Her husband was on the other side. She waved desperately, but he couldn't cross. "It's temporary," she told herself. "They'll take it down soon, won't they?" Others weren't so hopeful. An elderly man, holding a small suitcase, sat down on the pavement. "I was going to visit my sister," he whispered. "I don't think I'll see her again." His voice trembled as he looked at the wire. For many, the pain of separation began that very first day. The East German government had prepared for this moment carefully. They called it an anti-fascist protection barrier. They said the wall would protect East Berlin from spies and enemies in the West. But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't to keep enemies out. It was to keep people in. Over 2.5 million East Germans had already fled to the West by 1961. Most were young and educated. The government was losing its brightest workers. They needed to stop the escape. And so, they built the wall. At first, it was just barbed wire. But the plan was much bigger. Soon, it would be concrete. Tall, strong, unbreakable. As the sun rose higher that day, confusion turned into anger. In East Berlin, people gathered at the barriers. They shouted at the soldiers, "Why are you doing this? Let us through!" But the soldiers stood still, their faces hard. A young woman, her eyes red from crying, pushed forward. She begged to cross. "Please," she said. "My mother is in the West. She's sick. She needs me." A soldier looked at her but said nothing. She fell to her knees, sobbing. In West Berlin, it was the same. People ran to the new border, calling out for their friends and family. They waved across the wire, some holding up signs. "We're here," one sign read. "Don't lose hope." But the distance between East and West already felt too great. The scenes of that day spread quickly. Reporters from around the world came to Berlin. They took pictures of the barbed wire and the desperate faces of the people. The world watched as Berlin became the front line of the Cold War. The leaders of West Berlin called it a day of shame. They couldn't believe what had happened overnight. The mayor of the city, Willy Brandt, stood in front of a crowd and spoke with a heavy heart. "Berlin will survive this," he said. "But the scars, they will last forever." In the East, there was silence. The government controlled the newspapers. It told its people the wall was necessary. It was for their safety. Some believed it, most didn't, but no one dared to speak out. That first night after the wall went up, Berlin felt like a ghost town. In the East, the streets were empty. People stayed inside, too scared to go out. In the West, crowds gathered near the border. They lit candles. They sang songs. Their voices carried through the quiet streets, over the wire, and into the dark. An old woman in the East listened from her window. Tears streamed down her face as she heard the faint sound of music. "Will I ever walk those streets again?" she whispered. In the days that followed, the wall grew stronger. Soldiers replaced the barbed wire with concrete. They added watchtowers and armed guards. Every street, every train line, every tiny path was sealed. The city was no longer one. For many, the shock of that first day turned into despair. A young boy in East Berlin looked out his window. He could see a park in the west where he used to play with his cousins. Now, it was out of reach. "Why did they do this?" he asked his father. His father didn't answer. He just looked away. On the other side, a woman in West Berlin walked to the wire every morning. She stood there, hoping to see her sister on the other side. Sometimes she waited for hours. Sometimes she thought she saw a familiar face. But the soldiers always made people move along. Life in Berlin would never be the same again. The wall was more than just a barrier of concrete and wire. It was a wall of fear, silence, and heartbreak. People on both sides knew it was wrong, but they also knew it was dangerous to fight back. For Berliners, August 13th, 1961 would always be remembered. It was the day their city was split in two, the day families were torn apart, the day the Cold War became real. But even as the wall rose higher, so did hope. Quietly, in whispers and hidden glances, Berliners began to dream. Maybe one day the wall would fall. Until then, They would wait. Chapter 3. Brick by Brick, Building the Wall. The Berlin Wall didn't start as the tall, gray fortress we imagine today. It began with barbed wire, simple, sharp, and cruel. But behind that wire was a bigger plan. In August 1961, East Germany's leaders made a choice. Too many people were leaving for the West. Teachers, doctors, engineers, young, talented workers. They were escaping. The government couldn't stop them with rules alone. They needed something stronger, something permanent. And so, the wall began to grow. The leaders of East Germany, the GDR, German Democratic Republic, told the people that the wall was necessary. They called it an anti-fascist protection barrier. They said it would protect them from spies and enemies in the West. But the truth was different. The wall wasn't about protection. It was about control. The Soviet Union supported the plan. They wanted to show strength during the Cold War. Berlin was a symbol, and the wall became their message. It said, "You cannot leave. You cannot escape. You belong to us." At first, the wall seemed simple. Barbed wire stretched across streets and parks. But soon, workers arrived with concrete slabs. The East German government worked quickly. They didn't want the West to stop them. Each day, the wall grew taller and longer. Soldiers guarded the workers. If anyone got too close, they were pushed back. The noise of hammers and drills filled the air. The city felt like a construction site. But no one wanted this construction. A young woman in East Berlin watched from her window. Her street had been split in two. She saw neighbors on the other side waving to her, but she couldn't reach them. "They're building a prison," she thought. The wall was more than just concrete. It was a system designed to keep people trapped. Over time, new features were added. Each one made escaping harder. First, they added guard towers, tall, cold structures. Soldiers with guns stood inside, watching the border. They looked for anyone who might try to cross. Then came the death strip. It was a wide, empty space between two walls. The ground was covered with gravel, which made noise if someone ran across it. Floodlights lit the area at night. Escapees would be easy to spot. Barbed wire fences lined the death strip. There were also tripwires connected to alarms. If someone touched them, the guards would come running. Finally, there were dogs, trained to attack. They patrolled the wall with their handlers, barking at anyone who came too close. The wall wasn't just built in Berlin. It stretched across the entire border between East and West Germany. Over 1,300 kilometers of fences, watchtowers, and walls. But the wall in Berlin was the most famous part. It divided families, friends, and lives. Building the wall wasn't cheap. It took money, time, and effort. But for the East German government, it was worth it. Every day the wall grew stronger. Every day freedom felt further away. In West Berlin, people watched in horror. They couldn't believe what was happening. Some cried as they saw the wall rising higher. Others protested, shouting at the soldiers on the other side. "Tear it down!" they yelled. But the soldiers ignored them. Children in West Berlin asked their parents, "Why can't they come here?" Parents didn't know how to explain. How could they? The wall didn't make sense to anyone. A man in West Berlin came to the border every morning. He waved to his wife, who was stuck in the east. She waved back, tears in her eyes. For weeks, they stood like that, separated by concrete. Until one day, she didn't come. The wall changed everything in East Berlin. Streets that once connected the city were now blocked. Families who lived only a few meters apart couldn't see each other anymore. Train stations in the east were closed. People couldn't travel. Even daily life became harder. The government increased security. Secret police, known as the Stasi, watched everyone. Neighbors spied on each other. Fear spread like a shadow over the city. A father in East Berlin told his daughter, "Don't talk about the wall. Don't ask questions." She nodded, confused. "Why not?" she asked. He shook his head. "It's safer this way," he said quietly. For some, the wall was a challenge. They wanted to escape, to find freedom. But escaping wasn't easy. The wall was designed to stop even the bravest attempts. One night, a young man tried to swim across the Spree River, which ran along the border. He moved quietly, staying low in the water. But the guards saw him. They fired their guns, and the river grew silent. A group of students tried to dig a tunnel under the wall. They worked for weeks, digging with small tools. But the Stasi discovered their plan. The students were arrested. Their dream of freedom ended in a cold prison cell. Not everyone in East Berlin agreed with the wall. But speaking out was dangerous. People who protested were arrested, or worse. Many felt powerless, but others found small ways to resist. They painted graffiti on the wall, writing messages of hope. Freedom will come. This wall will fall. These messages gave people strength. In West Berlin, the wall became a canvas for art and protest. Colorful murals appeared, telling stories of hope and unity. One artist painted a bright sun on the wall. It was a reminder that darkness doesn't last forever. By the 1970s, the wall had become a symbol of the Cold War. Leaders from around the world came to West Berlin. They stood in front of the wall and gave speeches. They called for freedom and unity. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan visited Berlin. Standing near the wall, he said the famous words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The crowd cheered. But in the East, those words were forbidden. People heard them only in whispers. The wall may have been strong, but the people's spirit was stronger. In secret, East Berliners began to hope. They started to dream of a world without walls. A young boy in East Berlin drew pictures of what he imagined: parks, bridges, and open streets. His mother looked at the drawing and smiled. "Maybe one day," she said softly. For now, the wall stood tall. It seemed unstoppable. But deep inside, cracks were forming, not in the concrete, but in the system. Change was coming, The wall wouldn't last forever. Chapter 4. Life Behind the Wall. In East Berlin, life changed the moment the wall went up. For the people living there, it wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a constant reminder of what they couldn't have. Freedom. We could see freedom, but we couldn't reach it. That's how many East Berliners described their lives. From their windows, they could sometimes see West Berlin. The bright lights of cafes, the busy streets, the laughter of children playing in parks. But they couldn't cross. The wall stopped them. Day after day, the wall loomed over their lives. Life in East Berlin was controlled by the government. They decided where you worked, what you learned in school, and even what you could say. People were told that socialism was the best way to live. They were told that the West was dangerous. But many didn't believe it. Jobs were chosen for you. If you wanted to be a teacher or a doctor, the government had to approve it. If they didn't like your family or your political views, they might send you to work in a factory instead. A young man named Hans wanted to be an engineer. He loved building things. But his father had spoken against the government years ago, so Hans wasn't allowed to go to university. Instead, he worked in a coal plant. Every day he looked at the black smoke rising into the sky and wondered what his life could have been. School in East Berlin was strict. Students were taught to follow the rules. They learned about socialism and how it was better than capitalism. But some teachers added their own messages, quiet ones. One teacher, Frau Schneider, loved history. She told her students about Germany's past, but she also spoke of hope. History is always changing, she would say. Nothing stays the same forever. Her students nodded, pretending to take notes. They knew what she really meant. Daily life was filled with rules. People lined up for food at government shops. The shelves were often half empty. Fresh fruit was rare. Meat was expensive. People learned to make do with what they had. At home, families spoke in whispers. Parents warned their children, "Don't talk about the wall. Don't complain at school." The Stasi, the secret police, could be anywhere. They could be listening. Even neighbors couldn't always be trusted. Some people spied for the government. They reported what others said or did. A kind smile could hide dangerous intentions. One woman, Marta, found this out the hard way. She told her friend that she wanted to visit her brother in the West. A week later, the Stasi came to her door. Her friend had reported her. Marta lost her job and was watched by the police for years. She never trusted anyone again. Despite the fear, people found small ways to live. Families gathered for dinners, sharing stories and jokes. They celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes. Children played in the streets, kicking soccer balls and riding bikes. Life wasn't easy, but it went on. Still, the wall was always there, a reminder, a shadow. People tried to distract themselves. The government organized parades and events praising socialism. Workers marched with red flags, shouting slogans. Children sang songs about a bright future. But deep down, many didn't believe it. In their hearts, they dreamed of freedom. Letters became lifelines. Families separated by the wall wrote to each other. They shared news, pictures, and small gifts, but letters were often read by the Stasi before they were delivered. Anything suspicious was removed. One young girl, Anya, wrote to her grandmother in the West. She drew a picture of the wall with the words, "Tear it down." The letter never arrived. Her parents were called in for questioning. After that, Anya was told to only write about her school and the weather. Some East Berliners tried to make the best of things. They joined government organizations, hoping for better jobs or housing. Others stayed quiet, keeping their heads down. But some resisted in small ways. A man named Klaus was a musician. He wrote songs about hope and freedom. He performed them at small gatherings, careful not to attract too much attention. His songs spread quietly, like whispers in the wind. "The wall can't stop our dreams," one of his lyrics said. People sang his songs in their homes, softly, so no one could hear. Life behind the wall wasn't just about fear. It was also about waiting. Waiting for change. Waiting for a day when the wall would fall. An elderly woman named Greta lived near the border. Every morning, she sat by her window, looking at the wall. She remembered a time when Berlin was one city. "It can be one again," she would say to herself. Her granddaughter didn't understand. "The wall will never come down," she said. Greta just smiled. Hope wasn't easy to hold on to, but it was there, in small moments. One winter, snow covered the city. Children built snowmen near the wall. They laughed and threw snowballs, pretending the wall didn't exist. For a moment, it felt like freedom. In spring, flowers bloomed along the death strip. A young couple in East Berlin planted seeds near the wall. It was a quiet act of defiance. Bright colors against the gray concrete. East Berliners found ways to share hope with the West. Sometimes they waved from their windows. Sometimes they sent messages hidden in books or packages. A single sentence could mean everything. "We haven't given up." In West Berlin, people responded with messages of their own. They painted graffiti on the wall. They sent balloons carrying notes over the border. One note simply read, "We're with you." The wall shaped every part of life. People lived in its shadow, but they didn't stop dreaming. A boy named Peter sat on his bed one night, looking at a postcard of New York City. His uncle had sent it from the West. Peter stared at the tall buildings, the wide streets, the Statue of Liberty. One day, he thought, "I'll see it for myself." His mother walked in and saw the postcard. She didn't take it away. She just kissed his forehead and said, "Maybe you will." Life behind the wall was hard. It was full of fear, rules, and loss, but it was also full of quiet strength. East Berliners found ways to survive. They found ways to hope. And deep inside, they knew one thing: walls don't last forever. Chapter 5. A View from the West. For the people of West Berlin, the wall was more than just concrete and wire. It was a scar. It cut through their city, separating families, friends, and lives. Every time they saw it, they felt its weight, a symbol of fear and oppression. From the western side, the wall looked cold and uninviting. Graffiti covered the gray concrete. Bright colors and bold messages tried to hide the pain it represented. "Freedom!" one message shouted. "Tear it down!" cried another. Artists came from all over the world to paint on the wall, turning it into a canvas of hope and defiance. But no matter how beautiful the art, the wall itself stayed ugly. For many West Berliners, the wall was deeply personal. It wasn't just a political symbol. It was a daily reminder of loved ones left behind. A young man named Stefan visited the wall every week. His sister, Lena, lived on the other side in East Berlin. They had been inseparable as children. Now, they could only wave to each other from opposite sides of the wall. One day, Stefan brought a kite. He tied a letter to its tail and flew it high into the sky. The wind carried it over the wall. Lena found the kite later that evening. Inside the letter, Stefan had written, "I miss you. Don't give up." For Stefan, the wall was a thief. It had stolen his sister from him. The wall didn't just divide people, it divided emotions. In West Berlin, life continued. There were cafes, theaters, and concerts. The city was vibrant and full of energy, but no one could fully escape the shadow of the wall. At night, the floodlights from the wall's guard towers lit up the skyline. The lights were bright, cold, and unrelenting. They were a constant reminder of the people trapped on the other side. Some nights, West Berliners gathered near the wall. They sang songs, lit candles, and held hands. They couldn't tear the wall down, but they could show solidarity. Their voices carried over the wall, soft and hopeful. "We are here," they seemed to say. "We haven't forgotten you." The wall also became a point of curiosity for visitors from around the world. Tourists came to see it, to touch it, to take photos. They stood on platforms built near the border, looking into East Berlin. Some used binoculars to get a closer view. But for West Berliners, the wall was no spectacle. It was deeply painful. An elderly man named Klaus lived near one of these viewing platforms. He often saw tourists laughing, pointing, and taking pictures. One day, he stopped a young couple. "You think it's exciting?" he asked, his voice trembling. "For me, it's a prison. My son is over there, and I can't even hug him." The couple apologized, their smiles fading. For Klaus, the wall wasn't a tourist attraction. It was a wound that never healed. Life in West Berlin was free, but it wasn't easy. The city was surrounded by East Germany. It was like an island of democracy in a sea of communism. Supplies had to be brought in by plane or truck. The people of West Berlin knew they were being watched by the East. The wall felt like a threat, a warning. Leaders from around the world visited West Berlin to show their support. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy came to the city. Standing in front of the wall, he declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. The crowd erupted in cheers. His words gave them strength. But speeches weren't enough to remove the wall. For children in West Berlin, the wall was a mystery. They asked their parents, "Why can't we go to the other side?" Their parents tried to explain, but it was difficult. How do you explain something so cruel to a child? A little boy named Max lived near the wall. Every day he played with his toy cars in the street. He could see the wall from his home. Sometimes he imagined it was a castle with brave knights ready to break through. One day, Max asked his mother, "When will the wall come down?" She knelt beside him and said softly, "One day, Max, we just have to wait." Despite the wall's presence, West Berliners didn't stop hoping. They found ways to stay connected with the East. Letters, packages, and rare phone calls kept families and friendships alive. Churches on both sides of the wall worked together. They organized secret meetings and shared information. They prayed for unity and an end to the division. A pastor in West Berlin named Peter often stood near the wall, leading quiet prayers. "Lord," he said, "bring our city together again." His congregation murmured their agreement. Across the wall, East Berliners listened in silence, their hearts echoing the same prayer. For some in the West, the wall became a challenge. Activists organized protests and marches, demanding its removal. They held signs and chanted, "No more walls." They wrote letters to politicians and gathered signatures for petitions. A group of students even tried to climb the wall during a demonstration. They wanted to show that no barrier could stop them. But the guards on the other side quickly intervened. The students were forced back, their hands bruised and bleeding from the rough concrete. Still, their message was clear. The wall couldn't crush their spirit. The wall also inspired art and music. Musicians wrote songs about freedom and unity. Painters covered the western side of the wall with bright, bold images. Each piece of art was a protest, a declaration. One painting showed a giant hand breaking through the wall, holding a dove. Below it were the words, "Hope lives here." It became a symbol for the people of West Berlin. Every time they passed the wall, they saw the painting and remembered, walls don't last forever. The wall didn't just divide Berlin, it united people against it. West Berliners refused to accept it as permanent. They kept dreaming of a future without barriers. A woman named Anna walked by the wall every morning on her way to work. She always stopped for a moment, placing her hand on the cold concrete. "Not forever," she whispered. It became her daily ritual, a quiet act of defiance. For the people of West Berlin, the wall was both a burden and a motivator. It reminded them of what was lost, but it also strengthened their determination. They couldn't tear it down with their hands, but they could chip away at it with their hope. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 6. Escape Stories. Not everyone in East Berlin accepted life behind the wall. Some people dared to dream and dared to run. Escaping to West Berlin was dangerous. The wall was guarded day and night. There were watchtowers, armed soldiers, and a deadly strip of land filled with traps. The government called it the Death Strip for a reason. But for some, freedom was worth the risk. They couldn't live without hope. They couldn't stay in a place where they felt like prisoners. Their escape stories became legends. One of the first escapes happened just days after the wall was built. A young border guard named Konrad Schumann stood on duty near a section of barbed wire. He was only 19 years old, and he hated the wall. On August 15, 1961, he saw his chance. A group of West Berliners had gathered near the border. They shouted at him, "Come over!" Konrad's heart raced. If he jumped the wire, the East German guards would call him a traitor. He might never see his family again. But if he stayed, he would never be free. Konrad made his decision. He threw down his rifle and ran. With one quick leap, he jumped over the wire. West Berliners cheered as he landed safely on the other side. Someone took a photo of his escape. It became one of the most famous images of the Berlin Wall. Not everyone's escape was as quick. Many people had to plan for weeks, even months. One family, the Strelzics, dreamed of freedom for years. They decided to build a hot air balloon to fly over the wall. It seemed impossible, but they didn't give up. The family worked in secret. They sewed the balloon's fabric by hand, piece by piece. They used stolen cloth and a small gas burner to power the balloon. Each night, they whispered their plans, afraid someone might hear. Finally, on a cold night in 1979, the Strelzics were ready. The parents and their 2 children climbed into the homemade balloon. The wind was strong, and the balloon began to rise. They floated above the wall, high in the sky. Below them, the guards didn't notice. The family held their breath, terrified the balloon might fall, but after 28 minutes, they landed safely in West Germany. They laughed and cried, holding each other tightly. They had done it. Some escapes were dramatic. Others were clever. In 1964, a group of students in West Berlin decided to help people escape by digging a tunnel under the wall. It was a risky plan. The tunnel had to be long enough to reach East Berlin, but narrow enough to avoid detection. The students worked for weeks. They dug through the night, moving dirt by hand. They didn't use machines, afraid the noise would alert the guards. Every night, their hands grew sore, their muscles ached, but they kept going. Finally, the tunnel was complete. One by one, families from East Berlin crawled through the dark, muddy passage. They had to move quickly, afraid the tunnel might collapse or be discovered. In total, 57 people escaped through the tunnel. The students became heroes in the West. Not all escapes were successful. The wall claimed many lives. One tragic story is that of Peter Fechter. He was only 18 years old when he tried to escape in 1962. Peter and a friend ran toward the wall, hoping to climb over it, but the guards saw them. Peter's friend made it to the other side, but Peter was shot. He fell into the death strip, crying for help. No one dared to rescue him. The guards didn't move, and people in West Berlin could only watch. Peter died there, just meters from freedom. His story became a symbol of the wall's cruelty. But even in tragedy, there was courage. In 1988, two brothers, Ingo and Holger Bethke, made one of the most daring escapes. They had already escaped to the west years earlier, but their third brother, Egbert, was still in East Berlin. The brothers refused to leave him behind. They came up with a bold plan. They would fly back into East Berlin to rescue Egbert. The brothers built a small airplane out of lightweight metal and cloth. It was small, quiet, and fast. They practiced flying it in secret, waiting for the perfect night. Finally, the time came. Ingo and Holger flew over the wall, landed in East Berlin, and picked up their brother. The three brothers squeezed into the tiny plane. With the engine roaring, they flew back to the west. They risked everything for their family. And they made it. Not all escapes were about speed or strength. Some relied on clever disguises. One woman, Ingrid, dressed as a guard to sneak through a checkpoint. She borrowed a uniform from a friend and memorized the guards' routines. Walking confidently, she approached the border. Her heart pounded as she passed the guards. She nodded and kept walking, hoping no one would stop her. Finally, she reached West Berlin. She let out a shaky breath. Her disguise had worked. Even the smallest acts of defiance mattered. One man, Dieter, built a zip line from an apartment building in East Berlin to a building in the West. At night, he sent his family members across one by one. They clung to the rope, sliding to safety. By morning, they were free. Every escape story was different, but they all shared the same spirit. People risked their lives because they believed in something greater than fear. They believed in freedom. For those who made it, the feeling was indescribable. A woman who escaped in 1980 said, "The first step onto West Berlin soil felt like flying. For the first time, I could breathe." But for those who stayed behind, each escape brought mixed emotions. They felt joy for the people who made it, but they also felt pain. Pain because they were still trapped. A boy in East Berlin heard about the Strelzik family's balloon escape. He told his father, "Let's build one too." But his father shook his head sadly. "We can't," he said. "It's too dangerous." The boy didn't understand. All he knew was that freedom was out there, just beyond the wall. The escape stories became a source of hope for East Berliners. They whispered about them in secret. They shared the stories in code, saying, "Did you hear about the balloon?" Or, "Did you hear about the tunnel?" Each story proved one thing. The wall wasn't perfect. It could be beaten. And as long as people dreamed of freedom, they would keep trying. Chapter 7. Torn Apart. Families on Both Sides. When the wall went up in 1961, it didn't just divide a city. It divided lives. Families who had lived close for years were suddenly separated by concrete and wire. Fathers couldn't see their children. Brothers couldn't visit their sisters. Grandparents couldn't hold their grandchildren. I couldn't hug my mother. I couldn't kiss my father good night. That was how one East Berliner described it. The wall tore families apart, and for many, the pain was unbearable. Before the wall, people moved freely between East and West Berlin. A father working in the West could come home to his family in the East every evening. Friends visited each other's homes for dinner. Cousins played together in the parks. But when the wall was built, everything changed overnight. Roads were blocked, trains stopped running, borders were closed. Families woke up to a new reality. They were trapped on opposite sides. For some, it happened so suddenly that they didn't have time to say goodbye. Anya, a young woman in East Berlin, had spent the weekend at her aunt's house in the West. She returned home on Sunday night, not knowing it would be her last trip. The next morning, the wall was there. Anya tried to call her aunt, but the phone lines were cut. Months passed, then years. Anya never saw her aunt again. For those separated by the wall, letters became lifelines. Families wrote to each other often, but the letters weren't private. In East Berlin, the Stasi read every word before delivering them. People had to be careful about what they said. "Dear Mother," one letter began, "we are well. The children are growing fast. We think of you every day." The writer wanted to say more, to share her anger and sadness, but she didn't dare. Sometimes letters didn't arrive at all. They were intercepted or lost. Families would wait for weeks, hoping for news. When no letter came, the silence was deafening. Phone calls were rare. East Berliners needed special permission to call the West. Even when they were allowed, the calls were expensive and short. A man in West Berlin saved money for weeks to call his father in the East. When the connection finally went through, his father's voice was shaky. "Are you okay?" the son asked. "Yes," the father replied, but his words sounded hollow. The call lasted only 3 minutes before the line was cut. 3 minutes wasn't enough. Visits were even harder. In the early years of the wall, East Berliners weren't allowed to visit the West at all. For West Berliners, visiting the East required long waits and special permits. Even then, the visits were closely watched. A grandmother from West Berlin applied for a permit to see her grandchildren in the East. After months of waiting, she was allowed a 2-day visit. When she arrived, she hugged them tightly, afraid to let go. She brought sweets and toys, small gifts from the West. But when she left, the goodbye was heartbreaking. Her grandchildren stood at the window, waving until she was out of sight. "When will you come back?" they asked. She didn't know. The wall didn't just separate people physically. It created emotional walls, too. Over time, some families grew apart. A brother in the West might write less often. A cousin in the East might stop answering letters. It wasn't because they didn't care. It was because the separation hurt too much. One man in West Berlin stopped calling his parents in the East. "It breaks my heart every time I hear their voices," he said. "It's easier not to call." For many, the wall wasn't just a barrier of concrete. It was a barrier of silence. But even in the darkest times, families found ways to stay connected. One father in East Berlin sent secret messages to his daughter in the West. He wrote them on the back of family photos. "We are okay," he wrote in tiny letters. "We love you." Another woman baked cakes for her brother in the West. She hid notes inside, under the icing. The cakes were sent by courier, and somehow the notes always reached him. These small acts of love kept hope alive. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas, birthdays, weddings, all the moments families should have spent together were marked by absence. On Christmas Eve in West Berlin, a family gathered around their tree. They sang carols and opened presents, but their hearts were heavy. Their grandparents were in the East, celebrating alone. In East Berlin, a father lit a candle and placed it in the window. It faced West Berlin, where his daughter lived. He hoped she could see it. "This candle is for you," he whispered. The wall also brought fear. East Berliners worried about being watched. If they spoke too openly about missing their loved ones, the Stasi might suspect them of wanting to escape. Some people were arrested simply for writing letters or talking about the West. One woman in East Berlin hadn't heard from her sister in the West for months. She confided in a friend, saying, "I'm worried. What if something has happened to her?" A week later, she was questioned by the Stasi. After that, she stopped talking about her sister. For children, the wall was confusing. A little boy in East Berlin asked his mother, "Why can't I see Grandpa anymore?" His mother didn't know how to explain. She simply said, "There's a wall." The boy didn't understand. "Can we climb over it?" he asked. His mother shook her head. "No, we can't." "But why?" he asked again. She didn't have an answer. As the years passed, the pain of separation grew. Some families never saw each other again. Others were reunited only after decades. One woman in West Berlin waited 28 years to see her brother from the East. When the wall finally came down in 1989, they hugged for hours, tears streaming down their faces. "I never stopped thinking of you," she said. The wall didn't just divide a city, it divided hearts. But even in the face of separation, love endured. Families held on to hope. They found ways to stay connected, even when the wall tried to keep them apart. And through it all, they dreamed of the day they would be together again. Chapter 8: The Wall and the Cold War. After World War II, the world was divided. On one side was the Soviet Union, a communist superpower. On the other were the United States and its allies, who believed in democracy and capitalism. These two sides didn't trust each other. Their differences created tension, fear, and competition. This was called the Cold War. Berlin became the center of this global conflict. The city was like a tiny island of democracy, surrounded by communist East Germany. The wall didn't just divide Berlin, it became a symbol of the Cold War itself. The world held its breath, while Berlin was caught in the middle. In the East, the Soviet Union controlled everything. It wanted to spread communism across the world. Factories, farms, and even schools were run by the government. People had no freedom to choose where to live or work. In the West, the United States and its allies believed in freedom and free markets. They helped rebuild West Germany after the war. Cities grew stronger. People could start businesses, vote in elections, and speak their minds. Berlin showed this division clearly. On one side of the wall was control and restriction. On the other was freedom and opportunity. The wall wasn't just a barrier between East and West Berlin. It was a symbol of everything the Cold War represented. For the Soviet Union, the wall was proof of their power. It showed that they could keep their people under control. East Germany's leader, Walter Ulbricht, called it a protective barrier. He said it was built to stop Western spies from entering the East. But everyone knew the truth. For the United States and its allies, the wall was proof of oppression. It showed how far the Soviet Union would go to stop people from leaving. The wall wasn't protecting anyone. It was keeping people trapped. World leaders paid close attention to Berlin. What happened there could change everything. In 1948, long before the wall was built, the Soviets tried to block all supplies from reaching West Berlin. This was called the Berlin Blockade. They hoped to force the Allies to leave the city. But the Allies didn't give up. Instead, they began the Berlin Airlift. Planes flew into West Berlin every day, bringing food, medicine, and fuel. For almost a year, the people of West Berlin survived because of these flights. It was a victory for the West and a defeat for the Soviets. Years later, when the wall was built, it felt like the conflict was starting all over again. The Cold War wasn't fought with guns and bombs. It was fought with ideas, propaganda, and fear. In the East, newspapers and radio stations said the wall was necessary to protect the people. They said the West was dangerous. "We are keeping fascists out," the East German government declared. In the West, the wall was called a prison. Leaders spoke about the people trapped on the other side. U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin in 1963. Standing near the wall, he told the crowd, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. His words were a message of solidarity. The people cheered, but the wall still stood. For ordinary people, the Cold War made life tense. In the West, people worried about war. They knew the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. In the East, people lived under constant surveillance. The Stasi, East Germany's secret police, spied on everyone. Berlin was like a chessboard in the Cold War. Every move by the West was watched closely by the East, and vice versa. A mistake in Berlin could lead to a global crisis. One of the tensest moments came in 1961, just months after the wall was built. Soviet and American tanks faced each other at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the crossing points in Berlin. The world watched as the tanks stood nose to nose, ready for battle. Soldiers waited for orders. A single shot could start a war, but the standoff ended without violence. The tanks pulled back, and the crisis was avoided. For now. The wall became a symbol not just for Berliners, but for people around the world. It showed how divided the world had become. In schools, children learned about the wall. In East Germany, they were taught it was necessary to keep their country safe. In the West, children were told it was proof of the cruelty of communism. A young boy in West Berlin asked his father, "Why do they need a wall?" His father replied, "Because they're afraid of freedom." The Cold War wasn't just about politics. It was also about technology, space, and sports. The United States and the Soviet Union competed to prove who was stronger, smarter, and more advanced. They raced to send the first human to space. They competed in the Olympics, each wanting to win the most gold medals. But the wall stood as a constant reminder that their competition wasn't just for pride. It was about power. By the 1980s, cracks began to appear, not in the wall itself, but in the system it represented. The Soviet Union was struggling. Its economy was weak, and people in Eastern Europe were demanding change. Protests broke out in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. In 1987, U.S. President Ronald Reagan stood near the wall and gave a powerful speech. He looked toward the east and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." His words were a challenge to the Soviet leader. At the time, the wall seemed unbreakable. But change was coming. For Berliners, the Cold War was personal. It wasn't just about superpowers or speeches, it was about their lives. In East Berlin, people lived in fear. They couldn't speak freely or travel where they wanted. Every day, they saw the wall and knew they were trapped. In West Berlin, people lived with guilt. They had freedom, but they couldn't help their friends and family in the East. They stood at the wall, waved across it, and dreamed of a united city. The Cold War wasn't just about Berlin, but Berlin was its heart. The wall stood as a symbol of the division between East and West, communism and democracy, oppression and freedom. For nearly 30 years, the wall defined the Cold War. It divided a city, a country, and the world. But even as it stood tall, people never stopped hoping for change. The Cold War couldn't last forever, and neither could the wall. Chapter 9. The Beginning of the End. By the 1980s, the Berlin Wall had stood for nearly 2 decades. It seemed unbreakable, strong, permanent. But cracks were beginning to show, not in the wall itself, but in the system it represented. In Eastern Europe, people were tired. Tired of waiting in lines for food. Tired of being watched by the secret police. Tired of being told what to think, where to work, and how to live. They began to demand change. A crack appeared. In the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader in 1985. He introduced new ideas like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to reform communism. He believed the government should be less strict, that people should have more freedom to speak and think. These ideas spread across Eastern Europe. For the first time in years, people began to hope. If the Soviet Union could change, why couldn't East Germany? But East Germany's leader, Erich Honecker, didn't want change. He believed the wall and the system behind it were strong. The wall will stand for 100 more years, he said confidently. He was wrong. In East Germany, protests began to grow. Small at first, then bigger. In Leipzig, people gathered every Monday to march through the streets. They carried candles and signs. They chanted, "We are the people." Their message was clear. They wanted freedom. They wanted reform. The government tried to stop them. Police were sent to break up the protests. Some marchers were arrested. Others were beaten. But the protests didn't stop. Each week, more people joined. In Berlin, similar marches began. Fear was everywhere, but so was courage. A young woman named Anna marched with her friends. "We were scared," she said later, "but we couldn't stay silent anymore." The protests weren't just about East Germany. All across Eastern Europe, people were demanding change. In Poland, the Solidarity movement fought for workers' rights and free elections. In Hungary, the government began to open its borders. Thousands of East Germans traveled to Hungary, hoping to escape to the West. By 1989, Hungary made a historic decision. It removed its border fences with Austria, allowing East Germans to cross freely into Western Europe. The floodgates had opened. East Germans rushed to Hungary by the thousands. Families packed their cars and left everything behind. Long lines of cars stretched for miles. People carried suitcases, children, and hope. In Berlin, those left behind grew angry. They saw their friends and neighbors escaping and wondered why they couldn't do the same. The protests grew louder. Honecker and the East German government were losing control. The cracks in the system widened. Meanwhile, the West watched closely. Leaders like U.S. President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher pushed for change. Reagan had famously stood at the Berlin Wall in 1987 and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." His words inspired many. But the real change wasn't coming from speeches. It was coming from the people in the East who refused to stay silent any longer. The pressure on Honecker grew unbearable. Even his closest allies began to doubt him. In October 1989, Honecker was forced to resign. A new leader, Egon Krenz, took his place. Krenz promised reform, but it was too late. The people didn't trust him. They wanted real change. In November, the protests reached their peak. Over 500,000 people gathered in East Berlin. They filled the streets, chanting and waving banners. The government was overwhelmed. On November 9th, 1989, everything changed. A government official held a press conference. He announced that new travel rules would allow East Berliners to cross into the West. But his words were unclear. He didn't explain when the rules would start. A reporter asked, "When does this begin?" The official hesitated, then said, "Immediately." The news spread like wildfire. People rushed to the wall, unsure if it was true. Could they really cross? Was this the moment they had been waiting for? At first, the guards were confused. They hadn't received any orders. But as the crowds grew, the pressure became too much. Finally, the guards opened the gates. In that moment, the wall fell. Not with explosions or violence, but with celebration. People poured through the gates, laughing, crying, hugging strangers. West Berliners greeted them with open arms. Families who hadn't seen each other in years were reunited. A man named Peter crossed the border with his wife and children. "We're free!" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "We're finally free!" Berliners didn't just cross the wall. They climbed on top of it. They danced, sang, and cheered. Some brought hammers and chisels, chipping away at the concrete. Each piece they removed felt like breaking down a barrier in their hearts. A young boy watched his father take a swing at the wall with a hammer. "Why are you doing that?" he asked. His father smiled. "Because this wall doesn't belong here," he said. Around the world, people watched in amazement. Television screens showed images of joy and unity. In Paris, New York, and Tokyo, crowds gathered to celebrate. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than a moment. It was a symbol. It marked the end of an era. The Cold War was coming to a close. For East Berliners, the fall of the wall was the start of a new life. They could now travel freely, find new jobs, and speak without fear. For West Berliners, it was a chance to reconnect with loved ones and help rebuild the city. But the journey wasn't over. Reuniting Berlin and Germany would take time. There were challenges ahead, but in that moment, none of that mattered. The wall was falling. The cracks that began in the system had turned into a collapse. The people had won. Chapter 10. A Night to Remember. November 9th, 1989. It started as an ordinary day in Berlin. People went to work, children went to school. The wall still stood as it had for almost 30 years. But by nightfall, everything changed. It began with a press conference. A government official in East Berlin announced new rules. He said that East Germans would soon be allowed to travel freely. The reporters were confused. "When does this begin?" one of them asked. The official hesitated. Then he said the word that would change history. Immediately. His answer spread like wildfire. Within minutes, East Berliners heard the news. It didn't seem real. Could it be true? Could they finally cross the border? Crowds began to form at the wall. Hundreds of people came at first, then thousands. They pushed forward, demanding to be let through. The guards didn't know what to do. They hadn't received orders. The wall was supposed to keep people in. But now, the people were demanding freedom. The guards called their commanders, asking for instructions. The commanders didn't know what to say. The pressure was building. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., the guards opened the gates. The first people stepped into West Berlin, unsure of what would happen. But instead of being stopped, they were greeted with cheers. West Berliners hugged them, clapped, and shouted, "Welcome!" Soon, more and more people crossed. Some walked, some ran. Families reunited with tears and laughter. Friends hugged tightly, unable to believe it was real. One woman, Greta, crossed the border holding her granddaughter's hand. Her daughter was waiting on the other side. They hadn't seen each other in over 10 years. When they embraced, the crowd around them clapped and cheered. The wall was no longer a barrier. People climbed on top of it, celebrating together. They waved flags, danced, and sang. The cold November night was filled with warmth and joy. A young man named Lucas stood on the wall with his guitar. He strummed a simple tune and began to sing. Others joined him, their voices echoing through the streets. "Freedom," they sang. "Freedom at last." Some brought hammers and chisels to the wall. They began chipping away at the concrete. With each strike, they felt a sense of victory. An older man swung his hammer with all his strength. He had lived in East Berlin his entire life. "I never thought I would see this day," he said, tears in his eyes. "This wall stole so much from us. But tonight, we take it back." Pieces of the wall fell to the ground. People collected the fragments, holding them like treasures. Each piece was a symbol of the end of an era. The celebration continued through the night. In West Berlin, streets filled with people waving banners and drinking champagne. Strangers hugged each other. Children danced in the streets. In East Berlin, people celebrated too. For the first time, they felt hope. A man named Peter walked across the border with his wife and son. He stopped to look back at the wall, then turned to his wife. "It's over," he whispered. "We're free." The news spread around the world. Television screens showed images of the wall coming down. In Paris, London, and New York, people gathered to watch. They cheered for Berlin, for freedom, and for the end of the Cold War. One headline read, "The wall falls. The world unites." Leaders from around the world reacted with amazement. U.S. President George H.W. Bush called it a victory for freedom. German Chancellor Helmut Kohl promised to work toward uniting Germany. But the most important voices were those of ordinary people. They were the ones who had fought for this moment. For Berliners, it wasn't just the wall that fell. It was the fear, the pain, and the division that had ruled their lives for so long. A woman named Anna stood near Checkpoint Charlie, watching the crowds. She thought of her parents, who had passed away before the wall came down. They would have been so happy to see this, she said quietly. Nearby, a group of children played. They didn't understand the full meaning of the night, but they could feel the joy in the air. One little boy laughed as he climbed on a piece of the broken wall. His father smiled and said, "You're climbing on history." As the night went on, Berliners shared stories, memories, and dreams. They talked about the years of separation, the loved ones they had lost, and the future they hoped to build. One man from the East said, "I haven't seen my brother in 25 years. Tomorrow I'll visit him." His eyes filled with tears. "I can't wait to see his face." Another woman from the West said, "We've waited so long for this. Now we can finally be one city again." For decades, the wall had stood as a symbol of division. Now, it became a symbol of unity. By sunrise, the wall was covered with graffiti, flowers, and handprints. The pieces of concrete were no longer cold and gray. They were colorful and alive. Berliners began to clear the rubble together. East and West worked side by side, rebuilding their city. That night, November 9th, 1989, was more than just the fall of a wall. It was the end of an era. The Cold War, which had divided the world for so long, was finally coming to an end. But for the people of Berlin, it was personal. It was the night their city became whole again. A young woman named Clara held a piece of the wall in her hand. She smiled as she looked at the crowds. "This is more than concrete," she said. "It's proof that hope can win." Her friend nodded. "And that walls can fall." That night was a celebration of freedom. It was a night to remember. Chapter 11. After the fall. The wall was gone. Berliners were free. On November 9th, 1989, the city celebrated like never before. People danced in the streets, hugged strangers, and cheered for freedom. It felt like the end of a nightmare. But once the celebrations ended, a big question remained. What comes next? Reuniting East and West Berlin was not easy. After 28 years of separation, the two sides were like strangers. In East Berlin, life had been controlled by the government. People worked for state-owned factories, lived in state-owned apartments, and shopped at government-run stores. Jobs were guaranteed, but wages were low, and shelves in the shops were often empty. In West Berlin, life was very different. Businesses were private, the economy was stronger, and people had more freedom to choose their futures. Now, the two sides had to come together. But how could they build one city out of two such different worlds? At first, the reunification brought hope. East Berliners were excited to explore the West. They crossed the old border, wide-eyed, as they saw colorful advertisements, busy stores, and bright lights. Many West Berliners welcomed them with open arms. A man in West Berlin named Karl offered coffee and cake to strangers from the East. "Welcome," he said. "You're home now." But the excitement didn't last forever. For East Berliners, life in the new system was difficult. They were free, but they had to adjust to a new way of living. Jobs were no longer guaranteed. People had to compete for work. Many factories in the East closed because they couldn't keep up with Western businesses. Thousands of people lost their jobs. A woman named Erica had worked in the same factory for 20 years. When it closed, she didn't know what to do. "I was happy the wall fell," she said, "but I felt lost." West Berliners faced challenges too. They wanted to help, but reunification was expensive. Rebuilding East Berlin and supporting its people cost billions of marks. Taxes increased, and some West Berliners grew frustrated. A young man named Thomas said, "We want to help, but it feels like we're paying for everything. It's not fair." Tensions began to grow between the two sides. The physical wall was gone, but invisible walls still existed. East Berliners felt like second-class citizens. Their neighborhoods were poorer, their schools needed repairs, and their streets were full of potholes. Some West Berliners looked down on them, calling them Ossis, a nickname for people from the East. One woman from the East said, "We wanted to be part of Germany, but sometimes it felt like we weren't welcome." Meanwhile, some West Berliners thought East Berliners were ungrateful. They said, "We're helping them rebuild, but all they do is complain." The city was united, but the people still felt divided. Even so, there were moments of hope. In 1990, Germany officially became one country again. People gathered in Berlin to celebrate. Flags waved, fireworks lit up the sky, and the sound of singing filled the air. In the months that followed, Berliners worked to rebuild their city together. They removed the last pieces of the wall and cleaned the streets. Buildings in the East were repaired and painted. Schools and hospitals were improved. One of the most symbolic changes was the reopening of the Brandenburg Gate. For years, it had stood behind the wall, a symbol of division. Now, it became a symbol of unity. New opportunities brought people together. Artists from both sides of the city painted murals where the wall once stood. Musicians held concerts in the parks. Businesses in the West hired workers from the East. Students from East and West attended the same schools. A boy named Lucas, who had grown up in East Berlin, joined a soccer team in the West. At first, the other players teased him about his old shoes and strange accent. But after a few weeks, they accepted him. By the end of the season, They were friends. Still, healing took time. An older man named Friedrich lived in West Berlin, near the former border. For years, he had avoided speaking to people from the East. "They're not like us," he told his neighbors. But one day, he met a woman from the East named Ingrid. She told him about her life behind the wall, about the fear, the shortages, and the longing for freedom. Friedrich listened and realized they had more in common than he thought. From then on, he began to see East Berliners differently. For many Berliners, the hardest part of reunification wasn't rebuilding the city. It was rebuilding trust. A young woman named Anya, who had grown up in the East, said, "I was always told the West was the enemy. Now they're my neighbors. It's strange, but I'm learning to let go of the past." Her new neighbor Klaus replied, "And I was told that people in the East were brainwashed. But now I see that they're just like us. We're all Berliners." The reunification of Berlin wasn't perfect. Even decades later, differences between East and West remain. But the city has come a long way. Today, Berlin is a vibrant, unified city. Tourists visit the places where the wall once stood, learning its history. Berliners from both sides share stories of the past, proud of how far they've come. One day, an elderly man named Heinrich walked along the former border with his granddaughter. He pointed to a small piece of the wall still standing as a memorial. "I remember when this wall divided us," he said. His granddaughter looked up at him confused. "But why would anyone build a wall like that?" she asked. Heinrich smiled and shook his head. "Because they were afraid," he said. "But now it's gone. And we are stronger because of it." The fall of the wall was not just about freedom. It was about learning to live together again. It was about healing the wounds of the past and building a better future. Berliners faced challenges, but they also experienced triumphs. Slowly, step by step, they turned their divided city into one. Chapter 12: The Wall's Legacy. The Berlin Wall is gone. It no longer divides streets, families, or lives. But its story lives on. For 28 years, the wall stood as a symbol of division. It represented fear, control, and oppression. But when it fell, it became something else. It became a symbol of hope. Today, the wall reminds us of what people can achieve when they refuse to give up. The wall's story is more than just a chapter in Berlin's history. It is part of the world's history. It reminds us of the Cold War, a time when the world was split into two sides, East versus West, communism versus democracy. The wall was the ultimate symbol of that divide, but it also reminds us of the power of unity. When people on both sides of Berlin came together in 1989, they proved that walls don't last forever. In Berlin today, pieces of the wall still stand. They are not barriers anymore. They are monuments. Tourists from around the world visit the East Side Gallery, where artists have painted murals on the wall's remains. The colorful paintings tell stories of freedom, hope, and love. One painting shows a dove carrying an olive branch. Another shows people breaking through the wall with their bare hands. These pieces of the wall remind us of the strength of the human spirit. But the wall's legacy is not just physical. It lives in the hearts and minds of those who experienced it. A woman named Ingrid, who grew up in East Berlin, often tells her grandchildren about life before the wall fell. "It was a different world," she says. "We weren't free, but we never stopped dreaming." Her granddaughter listens closely, trying to imagine a life without freedom. "It's hard to believe," she says. "I'm glad it's over." The wall also teaches us important lessons. First, it shows us the dangers of fear and division. The wall was built because leaders in the East were afraid of losing control. They thought a wall could keep people in, but it couldn't stop their desire for freedom. Second, it shows us the strength of hope. For nearly 3 decades, Berliners on both sides of the wall dreamed of a better future. That hope kept them going, even in the darkest times. And finally, it teaches us that change is possible. The wall seemed permanent, indestructible, but it fell, proving that no barrier is too strong to be overcome. For the people of Berlin, the wall is a reminder of both pain and progress. Every year on November 9th, Berliners gather to remember the night the wall came down. They light candles, share stories, and celebrate their city's unity. One year, a boy named Lucas attended the ceremony with his parents. He asked his mother, "Why do we celebrate something so sad?" His mother smiled. "Because it didn't end in sadness," she said. It ended in hope. The wall's legacy has also inspired people around the world. It reminds us that division is never the answer. Walls may be built, but they can also be torn down. The Berlin Wall proved that. In countries facing conflict and division, people look to Berlin's story for inspiration. They see that unity is possible, even after years of separation. The wall's story is also told in books, films, and museums. At the Berlin Wall Memorial, visitors can learn about the people who lived, struggled, and dreamed during the years of division. They can hear stories of bravery, like those who escaped or helped others escape. They can also see the names of those who died trying to reach freedom. One visitor, a young girl, stood in front of the memorial and asked her father, "Why did people have to die?" Her father thought for a moment. Then he said, "Because freedom is worth fighting for." But the wall's legacy isn't just about the past. It's also about the future. Today, Berlin is a united city. Its streets are filled with art, music, and life. East and West Berliners work together, share stories, and build new memories. The city is proof that healing is possible. It wasn't easy. The scars of division remain. But Berliners have shown the world that it is possible to move forward. For those who lived through the wall, its fall was a moment of triumph. But it was also a moment of reflection. A man named Hans, who escaped to the West in 1968, returned to Berlin after the wall fell. He stood at the Brandenburg Gate, looking at the crowds. Tears filled his eyes. "We were divided for so long," he said. "But now we are one again." Nearby, a young woman placed a flower on a piece of the wall. She didn't live through its years of division, but she felt its importance. "This isn't just Berlin's story," she said. "It's everyone's story." The wall's fall reminds us that walls, physical or emotional, don't have to define us. They can be broken. It also reminds us to value freedom. For Berliners, freedom wasn't something they took for granted. It was something they fought for, dreamed of, and finally achieved. As time passes, fewer people remember the wall firsthand. But its story must not be forgotten. Teachers in Berlin tell their students about the wall's history. They take them to the memorials and share stories of courage and resilience. They remind them that freedom should never be taken for granted. One teacher told her class, "The wall divided us once. Let's make sure it never happens again." The Berlin Wall is gone, but its legacy remains. It reminds us of the pain of division, but also the joy of unity. It shows us that even the strongest barriers can be broken. It teaches us to value freedom and to fight for it, no matter how hard it seems. Most of all, it inspires us. Because walls can fall, and when they do, the world becomes a better place.